a moderate event today, but that's fine. And the purpose of these Carr-Ryan conversations is really to put people in dialogue with one another, rather than just have someone give us a talk. And so this, our first speaker today is Professor Ann Towns, and she is a professor from Gothenburg University. And she is one of, I want to just say it here, she's one of the world experts on this issue of gender and diplomacy, and really has been doing path-breaking work in this area. And she is joined by HKS alum, Desirée Cormier Smith, and who has been, and I've just learned a little more about Desiree's career, but who has been both a Foreign Service officer and a political appointee. So she's really a well-placed person to be able to talk about the issue of diplomacy, because she's seen it from kind of two different angles from in the US government. Okay. Now, let me just say a few more words about some of Professor Towns' work. I'm going to call her Ann Towns because I've known her for a long time. And so, and I hope that informality is okay with everyone. So she's the author of this book, Women in States, Norms and Hierarchies in International Society, and many important articles. And she's presenting today on her forthcoming book, her new book, is the title Imperial, Familial and Bureaucratic, Global Gender Logics of Bilateral Diplomacy. Now, she also has won a couple of really important awards from some of our professional societies, the International Studies Association, to recognize her contributions, both her intellectual contributions, but also her contributions more broadly to our profession. So it's a great pleasure to have her here at the Carr Center and at this event. And it's wonderful to have Desirée, who has joined the Carr Center this year as one of our foreign policy fellows. And I think this is our inaugural event for having a foreign policy fellow. We're going to have, and we are going to have another event with Desirée and all of our other 3 foreign policy fellows on Monday in the forum. So I really hope that you'll be able to make that event as well. So we're going to begin with, I want to just say a few more words though about Desirée. She has been a US Senior Policy Fellow at the Carr Center. She is a Senior Policy Fellow at the Carr Center. But she was also, as I said, a Foreign Service officer. She served in Mexico, South Africa, and Washington, D.C., and then later came back as a political appointee, where she served as the first special representative for racial equity and justice. Okay. And so we're really happy to have you here, and we're going to start with a brief presentation for Anne before we begin our conversation.
I also want to say, just to start, that I'm very grateful to the Carr Center and to Catherine for inviting me and for arranging this event, and for this opportunity also to speak with you, Desirée, about these really important issues. So thank you all around. So I've been given about 10 to 15 minutes to try and summarize the books. I will do that in just a minute. But I just want to start by placing the book in context, because I run a research program at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden that's on the gender of diplomacy. And so we're a team of people that do different kinds of work on what gender patterns look like in diplomacy and how they intersect with things like sexuality, race, class, colonial hierarchies, that sort of thing. And this is one of the books that I have kind of in the pipeline, but I'm also working on 2 other books. One of them is on the feminist foreign policy and how that is implemented by diplomats on the ground around the world, and how that implementation, what that looks like, if, you know, how it differs if you're posted to DC or if you're posted to Bogota or Maputo and so forth. And then I have a book that's planned that's about the kind of regendering of diplomacy historically, because this has really shifted. Women had a much more prominent place in diplomacy. Gender and sexuality was much more fluid in the 17th century. So I'm looking at how things changed from the 17th century to the present and why. So those are 2 kind of companion books that are coming. But now I'm, you know, my task now is to finish this book that I will tell you a bit about today. And that book takes as its basic point of departure. Sorry, I just have to see that I'm doing this. The recent history of masculinization of the diplomatic official. And by masculinization, I mean the thinking about certain traits as masculine and then assigning those masculine traits to diplomacy and to the diplomatic official, okay? And as an illustration, let me just read a quote from Harold Nicholson. You might not know who he is, but he's quite in diplomatic academies, he's quite the man, okay? He wrote a book called Diplomacy, and that everybody read. I think people still read that book, which is a manual, an instruction manual for how to be a diplomat. He was also a very ardent opponent of women serving as diplomatic officials, okay? And he made the argument that, just read from him, he said that the ideal diplomatist should be impartial, imperturbable, and a trifle inhuman. These are not female qualities, they're male qualities. So this is what he's doing. He's saying that diplomacy is about impartiality, being imperturbable, and being inhuman, right? Those are masculine traits, right? And thus, right, diplomacy is a masculine field. Women don't belong there. So in the 19th and early 20th centuries, rules were put in place. This is the era when diplomacy was formalized. Okay, this is when the MFAs, Ministries of Foreign Affairs, developed. We had new rules about exactly how diplomacy should be run, and rules were put in place then stating that women may not serve. Right, so only men could serve, and this is regardless of women's merit, regardless if they spoke several languages, could write letters the way you're supposed to have the formal education and so. This is also, if you think late 19th, early 20th century, height of European colonialism. Right? So this is a diplomatic system that's developing a particular kind of masculinity in the context of a very limited international society, so to speak. It was Europe, the Americas to some extent, Japan, China, and a few more states that were part of this kind of diplomatic system at this time. Right? The rest of the world was colonized. Right? So what we saw was that diplomacy became gendered in a particular European way. That's not necessarily to say that it was more patriarchal than other diplomatic systems that have been in place in other parts of the world, that it was differently patriarchal than those other systems, right? So it's a particular way to arrange and organize gender, right? And that's then what we're seeing, so we'll argue in this book, that we see the remnants of that in contemporary diplomacy. So then go to the 20th century. Oops, there we are. The rules, and Beatty here is bilateral diplomacy. In the 20th century, the rules started to change. So between the 1920s and the 1960s, state after state started lifting these bans on female diplomats. Brazil was one of the first countries to do so in 2018. US did so in 1920. Sweden, where I'm Swedish American, so Sweden, where I'm from, 1948, pretty late. Some countries not until the 1960s, okay? So the rules were changed, women could serve as diplomats, but they could not marry often. So male diplomats were expected to marry a woman, right? And she was expected to go with him and do all kinds of diplomatic functions, right? So the envoy was really a couple, a heterosexual couple, not an individual, right? The women then that were replacing the men they had to take the place of a couple. They had to do both the job of the male official and the wife, right, at once. So that's what was happening then in the 20s to 60s. Then in the 40s to 70s is when we had a huge wave of decolonization, right, with a large number of newly independent states that emerged and came into the international system and the diplomatic system. This is also when the 1961 Vienna Convention was codified, right, in the midst of this, because the new states wanted the convention, these European conventions, to not just be informal, like what everybody knew what to do, but put down on paper. Right? So they were asking for this to be codified. Then 1970s, okay, the marriage ban on women were lifted, so very late, right? And then we've seen since the 2000s, things have changed quite a bit. So now in the 2000s, we've seen much more active recruitment efforts, trying to incorporate more women and diversify ministries of foreign affairs more generally. So not just in terms of gender, but also in other ways, right? Also, we see that rules have changed. So same-sex spouses are allowed, right, recognized by some states. This is not regulated by the Vienna Convention, and it's not regulated in international law. So it's up to each state to determine whether they give diplomatic status to a same-sex spouse. And about 70 states now do so. There are 200 plus states in the world, and about 70 of them recognize same-sex spouses, diplomatic spouse. So we see that things have changed, right? Lots of women are now entering diplomacy in a couple of decades in countries like the United States or Sweden, where I'm working now, and a number of other countries, the Philippines, South Africa, right? There are quite a few women in the ministries for foreign affairs, right? You see same-sex diplomatic spouses, right? They're increasingly recognized. So my question, this is where my book starts, is so what does kind of the gender arena look like today? Right? Some diplomats will claim that, gender is something of the past, now it's open, the rules have changed, everything's fine. No, it's just a matter of time, things will change. So I wanted to know what happened to this European gender model of diplomacy, right, with decolonization. What do things look like today? And there's been so little scholarship on the gender of bilateral diplomacy that this was, for me, a wide open field when I started. So when I started the book, I asked some very basic questions, 3 very basic questions, okay? And then there are more specific questions in the book, but just to give you a sense. So the first one is, like, in what ways is contemporary bilateral diplomacy gendered? It's kind of like a political sociology, if you imagine, like just what do the gender patterns look like here? Right? Then second question is, what gender features of diplomacy have changed? What have remained the same over time? And then the third question has to do with how to theorize the gender bilateral diplomacy, right? What's the best theoretical kind of angle to get at this and to really see and understand gender in bilateral diplomacy? So since we just have a little bit of time, I'll just say a little bit about the first question, okay? So it's primarily that for this talk. And so when I study gender bilateral diplomacy, I think of it as a global gendered institution. This is a little bit of theory here first, then we'll get to the first question. And as an institution, that means that it's a system. It kind of hangs together, okay? So I think of that institution as a structured and relatively enduring system of norms and practices that helps to constitute actors, organize their behavior, okay? That means an institution is not an organization. It's not like the United Nations where you have a place that you go to, you enter into it, and right? This is an institution in the sense that its norms and practices, they're regular, that's hard for a Swede to say, regularized. And also bilateral diplomacy, there is no organization, right? It takes place in capitals around the world. So this is a diffuse institution that's decentralized, right? It's in a lot of different places. And yet the argument is in the book is that even though it's, again, practiced in New Delhi and Cairo and Tokyo, right? There's some shared elements in how it's gendered because it's a global institution. So it has some systemic features. They're not static or forever, but they're in place, right, and remain, and they're sticky. An institution also is complicated, it's complex, it consists of several parts, right? So I want to show, multiple of these parts. So one of those parts that I look at is the rules, like formal rules. What do rules, oops, sorry, I can't see. I'm looking for gender in the rules. That formally govern bilateral diplomacy. And that includes things like the Vienna Convention, and it includes things like protocol rules, but also rules for parental leave, who can marry whom, what does that do, right, for being a diplomatic official and being able to do your work. And here in the book, I look at the Vienna Convention, and you can see there how the rules kind of institutionalized the diplomatic official as a male heterosexual official, as a man with a spouse or a wife, sorry, right? That has since changed, but still, like much of that model, the heteropatriarchal model remains. It's worked best as a diplomat. It's easiest if you're a heterosexual man with a wife. Large part of the book look at official positions, and by positions, I mean international postings, okay? Where are male and female diplomats posted to, or ambassadors? So I look at ambassador postings. can we see patterns in those postings? And here, so this, I put together a very large data set, which looks at, it codes all the ambassadors that have been posted from 1968 to the present. And each year it's about 9,000 ambassadors in the world to code, so we can see changes over time. And with that, you can see patterns. So we can detect patterns like that male diplomats are more often sent to conflict areas, for instance, because there's a protective part still not wanting to send women in harm's way. But we also see that men continue to be overrepresented in the most important postings. So we're talking things like DC, Moscow, Beijing, London. You will have a higher share than average of male diplomats or male ambassadors posted there if you compare to averages. Okay? So there's still this sense where the most important, the places that are most militarily important, most economically important, that's the men get sent there. You also see patterns where women, female ambassadors, serve a symbolic function. Okay? So you might send them to signal policy or state identity in some ways. So we've looked at, for instance, states that are stigmatized as like the most patriarchal states, like Middle Eastern states, for instance, when they, so Saudi Arabia, right? They murdered Jugoshi, right, in, I forget, 2020. Right after that, nominates or appoint 3 female ambassadors. And where are they sent to? Stockholm, Oslo, DC, right? So places where you're signaling like we're making a change here, we're a different kind of state now. So we've seen statistically that states that are seen as more patriarchal, right, tend to, the few female ambassadors they have, they send where it like sends a policy alignment kind of message. Then I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna speed up a little bit and we can talk more about that later. The book also looks at how diplomats interact and network, because networking is extremely important in capitals, right? And we can see that gender also informs the kinds of networks that form, right? And there's some homosocialities that still remains homosociality, meaning male-only networking or female-only networking. And we see that there's a trend of new women-only networks, so female ambassador networks popping up in capitals all over the world as a response to what they say are old boy networks. Okay, so I have a chapter trying to trace out this. There's a chapter on diplomatic representability. In other words, how do you need to appear? What do you need to do to appear as a viable state representatives? And how is that gendered? We'll talk more about that in a bit, I think. And finally, I have a bit about how diplomats talk about diplomacy in gender terms. Kind of like Nicholson, right? What is diplomacy understood to be, and how do you use masculinization and feminization to talk about diplomacy? I'll just end there, but maybe I should have one final point, being that all these dimensions, I think we need to look at and add up all these different parts to understand how gender works. You can't just look at one piece, right? So for instance, how people dress might seem trivial, but when you line it up with all the other factors, then you get a fuller picture. Right, so I'm there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to turn right to Desirée and just say, can you reflect? I mean, I don't know if you need to give a few details about your career to begin with, and then reflect a bit on whether any of the points Anne made about her research are reflected at all in your own experience as a diplomat.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and thank you, Anne, for going through this really fascinating research. I can't wait to read your latest book. As Catherine mentioned, I began my career as a Foreign Service officer. Actually came here as a Pickering Fellow, and so I knew that I would be going straight to the Foreign Service after graduation. And I also came to the Kennedy School straight from undergrad. So I think that's important to note that I was quite young. I was one of the youngest ones in my class here. And when I joined the Foreign Service, I was one of the youngest in my A100 class. And so I think it's important to note that there's also an intersectionality here that really matters. So I'm going to speak as my experience as a young Black woman who entered the Foreign Service and was sent to these very specific places to represent the United States, right? Mexico, well, not in my bio, but I did spend a summer in Ethiopia. And then my first official tour was in Tijuana, Mexico, then South Africa, and then Washington, DC, where I worked with the African Union. So again, and all of these experiences, the perception of being very young, even though people have told me I look younger than I am, but that also mattered. So age and then race, right? And a lot of things stood out, and I'm very interested in hearing the questions from you all, because I think these are always much more interesting when they're more of a dialogue and more responsive to the things that you're most curious about. But off the bat, I mean, I think one of the ones we were talking about initially is this notion of diplomatic respectability, I would almost say, and how you represent yourself as a woman. The amount of comments I would get on my appearance from folks who I was interviewing in the consular line for visiting visas in Tijuana was remarkable, right? My male colleagues never had to deal with that. When I served as the arrest officer in Tijuana, so I was the US government representative visiting Americans who were arrested, and I had 3 male Mexican colleagues that would go with me. And even though I was the American official, whenever we would walk in to jails together, the Mexican prison official would always greet my male colleagues first, even though I was technically their supervisor, right? The amount of inappropriate comments I would get from male prisoners that I would be there to visit and ensure that they were, not being mistreated because of their citizenship, was remarkable, and something that my male colleagues noted that never happened when it was a male American Foreign Service officer doing these kinds of interviews. On the flip side, the reception and the relief that I that was very apparent when I visited women who were imprisoned was remarkable, right? They immediately felt almost safer, almost at ease. There was someone who kind of understood their needs. And the perspective I brought as the arrest officer, noting that, we would have these quarterly visits. And let me also back up a little bit. Tijuana, as you can imagine, because of the proximity to the United States, we had the largest number of Americans arrested in the world. So this was the busiest and largest portfolio in the world that I was dealing with as a 25-year-old recent graduate of HKS, right? But I loved it. I absolutely loved it. So we had these quarterly visits because there were these major prisons across Baja California that were in our jurisdiction. And people would always, assume that all the prisoners were men, but there weren't. There were women in these prisons as well. And I think I might have been the first to say, okay, we're doing these care packages for the men, but the care packages for the women don't include sanitary pads. That's a huge oversight. How can we, and when the prisons don't provide that, right? And so also bringing my perspective as a woman actually enabled us to better serve our citizens who were women, who were often neglected or forgotten about or overlooked. And then in South Africa, I was supposed to be in the political section, and I was hoping to focus on human rights, but at the last minute, they switched my assignment to be the special assistant to the ambassador and the deputy chief of mission. And that was a fascinating experience, but again, came with a lot of sort of gendered stereotypes because I was the special assistant, almost the chief of staff to the male ambassador. And so while I had a very substantive portfolio, a lot of folks assumed I was his secretary, right, or administrative staff. And so I would get comments, along those lines. I would get comments from folks within the embassy suggesting that because I was a young woman, that I could potentially approach a political figure that we hadn't made contact with in a very inappropriate way, right? Like, oh, well, why don't you try to call his cell phone and say that you met him at a bar? They would never make those kinds of comments to a male Foreign Service officer. There were instances at receptions at the ambassador's residence, including our 4th of July residence, where well-known political figures from South Africa and businessmen from South Africa would make very inappropriate sexualized comments to me. And when I would report that, it was kind of laughed off, right? So again, these are all experiences that never happened with any of my male counterparts, or even older women, right? So again, this is why the age also comes into play. And then when I came to DC, and I was working with the African Union, I'll never forget, even though I was working for a woman assistant secretary at the time of African Affairs, and she was very good about mentoring young women and making sure that we were seen and our work was valued and we got credit for our work. She asked me to join a meeting that she was having with one of the 4 commissioners of the African Union. And this was the Commissioner for Peace and Security. And I escorted him into the State Department and walked him to the room where they would be meeting. And I was supposed to be the note taker to write the reporting cable afterwards. But he instead said, yes, I'd like coffee instead of tea, please. And sent me off to get coffee. Whereas I was supposed to be the note taker. So I missed a whole section of the meeting because I was off to get him coffee because no one wanted to disrespect him. Right. So it's these kinds of things that, again, because of intersectionality and who I am in the world, I think I uniquely experience. And I know that my colleagues who were young women who had a disability, right, who have a disability, they were also treated differently in the workplace. My colleagues, even when I was special representative for racial equity and justice, one of my counterparts was a special advisor for international disability rights. She was a young woman with a disability who was Muslim. So the interactions and the way that she experienced the State Department was completely different than my experience, right? So I think it's also important to remember that people have different identities, and the complexity of those identities also impact their experience or their perception as diplomats.
Thank you so much. That was exactly what we were hoping. Theory and practice here. So I have a few questions, and then we're going to open as early as we can for you. So I want you all to be thinking already the questions that you have for our panelists. So I just want to start, and the title of your book has Imperial, Familial, and Bureaucratic Global Gender Logics. Now, I think you've told us a bit about the bureaucratic ones, but I want you to say a few words about the imperial and familial part of it, which you've told me a little about the imperial part, but what's the family part here?
So the familial part, I think, is to some extent, it's maybe also particular to bilateral diplomacy if we compare with multilateral diplomacy. So again, the envoys I was talking about before, the way this model, which was a European imperial model, the way it developed, right, was through these residence missions. So if you think an ambassador, they're posted in the capital, there's an embassy with an embassy residence, and that residence has a place for, again, ideally, a male ambassador and his wife and the family, right? And so the Vienna Convention includes, gives diplomatic status, not just to the diplomat, but to his wife and children, and some more family in some cases. So that familial logic of there being the husband official and the wife kind of permeates a lot of what bilateral diplomacy is. Not so much maybe in the daytime work, right? So not when you're going to, say that you're posted in Stockholm and you're having a meeting with a minister or some staff at the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. In that interaction, it's the familial part is not that present, right? But bilateral ambassadors have a work day that runs from morning until evening. They often work evenings, they often work weekends, doing things like afternoon teas or some sort of cocktail party or a gala or an inauguration and all kinds of ceremonial types of things that they're expected to do. And it's a big part of their workday. That's also where they network. It's where they're seen by others, right? So it's a very important part of what they do. And here you see the familial logic at work, because that presumes, right, that they're ideally that someone else takes care of, if they're children, that someone can watch them, right? so you can go out at night. And it's also upper class, I would say, or aristocratic, because often in the evening, the wives would go with the male diplomats. So you leave the kids with someone else, servants typically. Servants, by the way, are part of the Vienna Convention. They are also given diplomatic status, right, as part of the household. So this is the familial logic. The residence household, right, the working evenings and weekends, also hosting in the ambassador's residence. The residence is the home of the ambassador and a public state facility at the same time. So it's both, right? And when you host, you're supposed to host as a couple, right? And it's a little bit like the president and the president, and the wife, right? A little bit like the White House. So that's the familial logic that's still part of this. And I would say even in the bureaucratic, I'm looking at how the logics intersect, right? So the bureaucratic part only works, right? Because they're women typically that take care of children so that these diplomats can be posted around the world, right? And be at work whenever they need to. So even that has a familial part to it. But the most obvious thing, I think, again, is the evenings and weekend work, right? The diplomats are expected to do.
So, Desirée, I don't know if you want to jump in on this, because we wish that you'd been the ambassador. But I know you're not into that position yet. But did you see these imperial and familial logics at play in the work that you were doing?
Oh, absolutely. And, I served under 2 male ambassadors in South Africa, and it was very interesting to see how their wives, who were professionals in their own right, had to adjust to these expectations. And for both of the wives, I would say it was quite uncomfortable because they didn't want to just host cocktail parties. They didn't want to just be, the pretty figure next to the ambassador, shaking people's hands and not engaging in actual policy discussions. I mean, these were 2 brilliant women who left behind careers in the United States to support their husbands. It was very difficult for them. It was very difficult for them. And in between those 2 male ambassadors, there was an acting ambassador, chargé d'affaires, who was a woman, and she had 2 children. And it was hard for her to maintain all of these requirements as the acting ambassador. And even though her husband was a lovely, was a lovely man, it was different. And she also felt the obligation to be home with her children, right? You could tell the mom guilt that she was carrying when she had a full week of events after hours that prevented her from being home before the children went to bed. Whereas I never saw that guilt with the male ambassadors.
It might seem that this is something it's part of all professions, but it's accentuated in diplomacy and it's institutionalized. Okay, so it's part of the profession. Supposed to, right? You are supposed to attend these things at night. You're supposed to host in your residence, right? And it is very much modeled on heterosexual aristocratic couple, right? And it is, I've heard from my interviewees, it's typically easier for a woman who has a wife. The job is easier than for a woman that has a husband, because her wife can step into this role and is more willing to step into that role than the husband is, right? And these are career women, so often their husbands have stellar careers.
Yeah.
Being surgeons or finance, right? So they're not going to be going to all of her events in the evening and act as the host.
Right, yeah, I mean, there was one ambassador that I'm thinking of when you say, their husbands have stellar careers. Her husband was, I think, an orthopedic surgeon.
Yeah.
And she was posted in Europe, and I don't know if he refused, or he clearly didn't want to leave his job. And so he was based in Atlanta. And so they spent, years and months apart, and he would come visit her and she would come visit him as possible. But I'd never seen a male ambassador have to live apart from their spouse.
And here, I think also you were talking about intersectionality, which I think is so important in this. And one piece of that is, I think it's one thing if you're representing the United States, which is a well-resourced country, right? The US embassies have resources and they can compensate for the loss of a spouse to some extent with other staff, right? That organize the dinners and cook and make the flower arrangements and so forth. But imagine the Guatemalan ambassador that, right, is posted, if they have a spouse or wife, that provides some of the resources that the state doesn't. But if you're a woman and you have a husband that's not coming along, you have to do all this extra work because your state can't back you up. They don't have the resources to have a bunch of servants and
Right.
stuff, right? And you don't have a spouse to do it either. So that woman, it's like a double burden, right?
Yeah.
Or triple burden, I suppose, in that sense, yeah.
Okay, I just have one last question. Before we open to things that I'm gonna ask you, because we have this, this, what would appear to be lighthearted, but I think it's a very serious issue about diplomat representability, how they manage their appearance in order to present a viable. So I just want each of you to say a few words about that, and then we'll open to the public.
So this was an issue that took me a little bit by surprise because I came to diplomacy not knowing that much about diplomacy. So I came as an outsider, interviewing a lot of ambassadors, both male and female. And the women were all saying that one of the worst parts of the job is the appearance requirements, because ambassadors, again, highly visible, right? It's high status post, right? So people are looking at you all the time, and you have all these different kinds of engagements throughout a day. So you might have, a meeting with, some staffer. Then you have a business meeting with a business delegation. Then you have a luncheon at some charity. Then there's a, cocktail party in the afternoon. And in the evening, there might be a gala or some state ceremonial event or an event at another embassy. Throughout all those, these all come with dress codes, okay? So the men typically wear one suit during the day, may be changed to a different suit, or what's it called in English again? The tux at night. Whereas the women, right, have to change 4, 5, 6 times a day. So constantly changing clothes, different makeup, different hairdos, right? And then being monitored, right? And so that was a thing that came over and over. So part of my chapter, I did a little time survey where I just asked, through a survey, like how much time do you spend on your appearance? And it's a dramatic difference between male and female diplomats, how much time they need to devote to appear and embody a state in an appropriate way. Right? I don't want to know if you
No, yes. And my experience with this really differs from my time as a career diplomat and then as my time as special representative. So before joining, when I was still a Pickering Fellow here at the Kennedy School, I remember we had all of these sessions where retired ambassadors, current foreign service officers would kind of do these sessions with us to kind of prepare us for a career in the Foreign Service. And I remember a very well-meaning retired Black woman ambassador basically encouraged all of the young women in the group to ensure that the clothes they bought were oversized, and discouraged us from wearing makeup, and discouraged us from putting too much emphasis on our appearance, because if you look too pretty, no one will take you seriously. And I remember when I joined the Foreign Service, going shopping with my mom for like business attire and buying clothes that were 2 sizes too big. And I looked ridiculous, and I felt ridiculous, right? I looked like a kid playing dress up. And at a certain point, I can't remember what the turning point was, but I said, you know what, forget this. Like, I feel uncomfortable. I feel less confident, and this is not me. And so I started wearing clothes that reflected my personal style, obviously work appropriate, but I saw a noticeable increase in my confidence, and that was reflected in my work, right? I did a better job. And so that was me as a young diplomat. And then when I got assigned to this role as special representative, it's a much more visible, high profile role. And I would be traveling to different countries, and in every country I would be doing media interviews, sometimes newspaper features, or television shows. And so there was this pressure to always look very presentable, because as a woman, if you don't look nice, then somehow that makes them think you don't know what you're talking about, right? But it's this weird line, because if you look too nice, then they don't think you know what you're talking about. But if you don't look nice at all, then they're like, well, this person doesn't even care about their appearance. How can they care about this issue? And this pressure to, always have the right amount of makeup on. My hair had to look nice, but not too nice. And then the clothes had to look had to obviously be culturally appropriate for the country where I was traveling to, be comfortable enough for me to be doing all of these meetings, mostly with civil society, but nice enough to meet with government officials and then maybe in the private sector, right? So all of these pressures. And I remember after one instance, my staff forgot to tell me, that I was going to be on a stage or something like that, like on a panel on the stage. And I wore a dress. And the dress was, to my knees. But on the stage, an elevated stage, your dress is to your knees, it could look inappropriate and I felt uncomfortable. And so after that, we had to have a whole new sort of thing where my staff would have to brief me on, what's the event type? Where will you be seated? What's appropriate in terms of clothes? They would never have to do that if I were a man, right? So it just became this added burden on myself, but also on my team. And I felt awful about it, but it had to be done.
So we're going to open it up now. I just want people to introduce yourselves and ask your question. Yes.
So, hi, I'm a fellow at the Bilateral Center, and I think it'd be really fascinating to know a little bit more about if there's actual differences in the ways that diplomats interact and network, as in what the results of the end result of the negotiation, if you like, because I negotiate very, very differently to my husband, but maybe that's not possible to say that men and women negotiate different ways. And there was this very interesting comment that you made, Desiree, where you actually said, well, care packages for women, maybe they need to include pads. This is amazing, and it gave me shivers. I thought, wow, this is incredible. So this is really a difference that happened because we're a woman in a way. And so is it possible to quantify this? Is it something that you've looked into, the deliverable being different in some way?
Really, really good question. I have not done that work yet. So the way I see my book, I see that as like laying the groundwork to be able to ask that question, okay? Because we can't ask that question unless we know whether there are gender patterns to how diplomats work first. And then once we know that, then we can proceed to those. So I imagine that we could ask those kinds of questions ahead, okay? But for that to work, we need data on like how many male, female, or non-binary. There are, to my knowledge, not any openly non-binary ambassadors at least. But like how many are there? What are they doing? How are they working, right? And then we can see like what are the outcomes of that. But I think that's a really important question to raise. And I think for all of you if you're in this room, it's a kind of question if you're writing theses or doing research that's really worthwhile addressing, right? Because I think that we would see, because this is not to say that obviously it's not about inherent differences necessarily in male and women, right? This is an institution, it's been institutionalized, but it means that we are differentiated. And, from my research and others, like women and men reach different groups in civil society, right? And connect with different types of people and might have different negotiation styles. And of course, that will have some sort of outcome difference, but I don't know what that is. So I think that that's an excellent question to ask. And I think in the negotiation field, right, that there's some research, I think, that I'm not an expert on mediation negotiations, but I think there's some research there showing that in terms of negotiations, there is some distinctions also, I think.
Yeah. And I think there is some data on the involvement of women in peace negotiations and how those tend to lead to more durable and inclusive peace. And I think, I don't know the numbers off my head, but I'm pretty sure that kind of data was used as the basis for the creation of the Women, Peace and Security program that the US government promoted, because there had been some data, and I don't know off the top of my head, that showed that women as peacekeepers, women as involved in the peace processes led to better outcomes that were more durable. But I don't think that they necessarily were limiting it to women diplomats, right? Yeah. It could be women police officers, it could be women community leaders, right? Women, just women engaged in community issues. And so I don't think there's data from the broad sort of diplomacy perspective.
Sorry, can I just say one more?
Okay, we got hands up. I'm gonna let us go this. Yes.
So one question for you I kept thinking, how did you respond to all these people, what they said to her? So that was because how did you keep your diplomatic self and check when you maybe wanted to scream or say something. And with your work, I kept thinking, I have a background, one part of my background was in film. And so I kept thinking, wow, she needs to make a documentary after she writes her 10 books. And I kept thinking, and I was kind of serious, I'm serious about that. Because some people are visual learners and the story that you're telling is very, very powerful documentary that could be made. But I watched The Diplomat, if anybody watched it, and I kept thinking, she has got to talk to the producers and the writers to get these storylines woven into the storyline of The Diplomat. And I'm being very serious about that. So no questions yet, but I have lots of questions, but those are my two questions, I guess.
Yeah.
Right.
So
I'll
here,
take some
but I'd
more.
love to her to answer.
Okay,
My
yes,
question.
and then I will turn to the back, because I don't want to ignore the people in the
Okay.
back of the hands up.
I would say that my responses as a younger diplomat vary from my responses as a more senior diplomat, right? So when I was younger, I think I, probably had some flippant responses to some folks. But it's harder to maintain composure and not get offended, particularly when some of the offensive things are said in a public space. Or really personalized, right? So it just varied. It's so like, for instance, when I was in Tijuana, there were a lot of instances where I would have interactions with CBP at the border, who not only questioned my nationality, so I'm Black, but in their eyes, I looked Mexican. I looked Mexican, right? And so that enough was gave them ammo to question me. Why was I going to the United States? Well, I'm a US diplomat. And I had some CBP officers ask, I remember one in particular said, are you sure you're not hiding your Mexican boyfriend in the trunk? Right? How do you respond to that?
How did you?
I just looked at him, I was like, no, what kind of question is that? So I found that making people kind of acknowledging the ridiculousness of the question made them embarrassed. And then I would just move on.
Okay, yes. Yes.
Hi, I'm Alana. Thank you both so much. So my question was just looking at diplomacy, specifically through the context of the US Foreign Service right now. As we sort of look at generally how DEI cuts, shuffling and downsizing State Department and what the long-term implications that could be on the current gender balance at state, right? Because I think right now the last figure I saw was like 38 to 44% in FSOs, but obviously in like higher level positions, the gender discrepancy is larger. But from your perspective, how do you see some of the current administrative actions affecting gender backsliding in US diplomacy?
I think it'll have a hugely negative impact. And I don't think we will fully know or appreciate the impact because they are no longer collecting data disaggregated by gender, race, or ethnicity. And that is heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking because we were making really good progress. But I think, again, and I always approach this with the intersectional lens, I think the impact on certain groups of women is going to be even worse, right? So there have been recent data that shows over 300,000 Black women are out of the workforce. The federal government was a huge employer of Black people, and the majority of Black women, particularly in areas or issues that are not aligned with this administration, have been dismissed. And so I think that will have a negative impact. I think it will be hard to determine the extent of that impact though, because of the lack of data collection.
Yes, here in the middle. Sorry, there's two people right in the middle here. So both of you, I'm going to call first and the person in the third row and then the person in the second row in front of
Thank
you.
you so much. My name is Victoria. I'm an MPP here. I'm quite interested in some of the things you said about, for example, using female diplomats as like policy signals. I wondered, and for me, that kind of represents like a sort of institutional resilience to change. I wondered if you thought, is like cultural change sufficient to kind of address some of these issues and address the gender balance and how it feels to be a woman in diplomacy? Or do you think there needs to be like a wholesale change in how diplomacy works and what it means to be a diplomat and the procedures around that to kind of address those things? And is that even possible?
Again, very good question. Depends a little bit what you mean by cultural. So do you mean like national cultural, like a big picture cultural kind of?
Culture in the sense like, having conversations like this and discussing
Okay.
what it feels like to be, I feel like
Oh,
that's
I
the kind of
see.
stage we're in
Yeah,
at the
so
moment.
not like values outside of
Yeah,
diplomacy.
versus exactly how,
Yeah.
because like what a diplomat means.
I mean, some of the things that need to change are very basic and thus kind of boring, right? It's things like the whole thing of like having families need to be solved. Like there needs to be parental leave, there needs to be all those sorts of things, right? And I think there needs to be some collective effort at internationally regulating also what the ways in which, right, diplomacy is gendered. So I think, these, again, like all these evening expectations, all the weekend expectations, this is not theoretically super interesting or novel stuff, but it's very key. This is every diplomat will say this, right? Male or female. So I think those things, if we can solve those things, that will take us some of the way at least, right? Then there's like the difference between what goes on inside of the State Department, inside of MFAs versus what happens to people when they're posted. So my work is primarily on what happens once you're posted somewhere. I don't so much look at what's inside of, and you have much more insight also what happens inside of the State Department. And those are two quite different things. Some of the people I interview say that they're much more discriminated against in their home ministries of foreign affairs than they are when they're posted abroad. And this is also because they're ambassadors. So like you were saying, it's a higher level. But if you come and you represent, if you are Kenya abroad, right? People will treat you somewhat respectfully if they know that you're Kenya, female or not, right? Whereas you might still encounter a lot in your home. And it's the same Australia. I know that there was an article coming out on this in Australia where Australian women were saying much more difficulty in the home MFA than when they were posted abroad, right? So where those conversations need to be, I think is also a question that's important, right? And some of this is like the stagnant things that institutionally in the home MFAs.
Ministry of Foreign Affairs,
Yeah, sorry, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Yeah.
our State Department.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Rebecca. I have a slightly sartorial question, if that's okay. I'm thinking of Karen Pierce, the former British ambassador to the US, who, when she was appointed, was asked, are you going to be changing your outfits, which were typically quite flashy and full of patterns and colour? And she said, absolutely not. I think it's an asset and it shows my personality. Have you been able to map in a sort of quantitative sense whether women who are dressing in sort of more male, they're wearing a pantsuit and they're wearing what was been typically deemed a sort of male outfit, have they been received better than women who actually take advantage of the opportunity to have 6 outfits and not just a suit?
Yes, I have not, but again, excellent question. And again, I think that I would like my book to lay the groundwork for precisely doing that, right? Drawing attention to it, showing that this is a really important arena. And then I think you can then start comparing, right? Like what are the consequences of dressing one way or another? My guess would be that it's not going to be, that it's always the same effect of doing the same thing. Right? Much of this is contingent, right? It will depend on both the personality of the person doing it, the context in which it's done and so forth, right? But I think it's a very good question to ask if you're writing on like this. So. Yes.
I have a question that's a little bit more theoretical. I think in the US, we've seen that like partially because of the perception that like women are softer, more diplomatic, then sometimes when women rise to high positions of power, they feel a need to be more sometimes hawkish or more military focused or kind of prove that. Can you talk a little bit about the tension between like needing to prove yourself in a very masculine system while also being like, actually there is a benefit to like places, the fact that like there is data that shows that women in higher positions of diplomatic power have like more peaceful countries. So kind of the tension between trying to prove yourself and also trying to change the system that you're in using the fact that you're a woman.
You want to start this time?
Sure. I mean, I think I saw this a lot, and I also think that there's a generational difference. What I noticed about the younger generation coming into the State Department is that they really own their identity and they want to bring their full selves and their lived experiences and their perspectives to their work. And I think that actually would make our policies better. Whereas a lot of the older women, more senior women that are kind of starting to retire, they entered the workforce, and I don't think it was they're on their own. I don't think many of them wanted to do this, but I think they were sort of forced to kind of assimilate. So they really needed to not wear flashy clothes, right? Kind of look like a man, act like a man, think like a man to succeed. And I think there is a tension that I'm noticing between that generation and the younger generations that's saying, no, this is our power. This is our superpower for us to come in as women and bring our own perspectives to this instead of trying to come in as women and act like men. So I am excited about that change because I do think that when people are empowered to bring their full selves and perspectives to their work, it leads to better outcomes versus trying for everyone to think the same.
I'm going to take the privilege of the last question because, as you know, we have at the Carr Center a wonderful LGBTQ program, and your book's about gender and diplomacy, but it's really about women and diplomacy, right? And so I wonder, or the part we've heard so far, and so I wonder what this research on gender and diplomacy can also reveal about sexual identity.
A very interesting question. So I would say the book is about gender and diplomacy because it looks at like how men have been included, women excluded, right? So, you know, focusing on women to some extent now is a way to look at the gender structure of it. So I would start by that. But to do that, of course, you know, I haven't talked about intersectionality in this presentation at all, but the book is intersectional, right? And there's no way to understand this without also understanding age, class, race, sexuality. And sexuality is a very important part of this because it's a heterosexual kind of patriarchy that is at the foundation, right, of diplomacy and bilateral diplomacy. Again, with the familial logic that we have, it's a heterosexual familial logic. It is male diplomat, female wife, and so forth. And so much of how bilateral diplomacy works is, again, premised on that. Every dinner they're invited to, it's a +1, but the expectation being, right, like opposite sex +1. Right? So much of it, it is that also, the heterosexuality part of it is also woven into what bilateral diplomacy is and how it's practiced. And again, expectation, right? Like I said at the beginning, only 70% recognize same-sex spouses as, you know, give them diplomatic status. Which means, right, if you have a gay ambassador, right, and you want to bring your spouse, you can't necessarily. They have to come as in awkward ways, right, as the chauffeur or, right, like some sort of staff in the embassy, right?
And without the same diplomatic protections.
Exactly, without the same diplomatic protections. So, you know, the heterosexuality of it, everybody recognizes, right? A wife of a husband will always have diplomatic protections, right? But same-sex spouses do not. And this again is Vienna Convention, right? It's international law. So, you know, that part of the story is very much part of what the book does. That said, one can also do much more about kind of centering, right? Which would then be, you can center the experiences and positionality of, you know, LGBTQ ambassadors or diplomats in the story, right? As a way to understand the kind of heterosexual foundation of and the heterosexual norms, right? And there's research now doing this coming out of Australia and some other places, right? Heterosexuality becomes the center, but I don't, you know, do as much with these particular experiences as one could, but that's because in one book you can't, right? It's not, and I write that into the book. It's not that it's less important, right? It's more of lenses that any one book can't give equal amount of attention to every dimension. It needs to be in there. So just like race needs to be part of the book, race is part of the book, but it's not the primary lens, right? It's a backgrounded lens, if that makes sense.
And any last words, Desirée?
No, I mean, I think we clearly could go on much longer by the number of hands left in the audience. But this has just been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you for inviting me into it. I wish we had more time to talk about some of the other, things. And one of the things that I kept thinking about was also my experience when I was pregnant and how I was received by foreign diplomats. And I keep thinking of this interaction I had with the foreign minister of Guatemala. I'm 7 months pregnant, and I'm there to talk about, you know, how they could better include indigenous peoples in the labor market. And he could not stop talking about how pregnant I was. And I'm like, Mr. Minister, we're here to talk about your economy and how we can, you know, help you build a more robust and inclusive economy. Oh, so pregnant. Yes, Mr. Minister, let's talk about the labor data. You know, are you gonna burst, or is it a boy? And it's like, Mr. Minister, and a man would never have to spend the time and mental energy to continue to redirect the conversation to the substance.
A diplomat.
So on that note, I know that Ann and Desiree will probably, if there are burning questions still here, I'm sure they'll stay afterwards
Yes,
and talk to you. So thank you so much.